well be of benefit in the clinical setting. And many of these involve high polarised technologies, which obviously has been a major focus of this meeting today. So what the clinical situation where such information might potentially be of benefit? If a patient sat in front of me, then am I going to use MR-based approaches to diagnose a chest condition? Well, I'm afraid the answer is it's relatively unlikely I would do, because usually I can get adequate diagnostic information from simple approaches, taking a history, examining a patient and doing conventional imaging. However, what I can't do is to get accurate information about which parts of the lung are working abnormally. And one of the real benefits, potentially, of functional imaging, such as that which can be offered by MR approaches, is that you can define the physiological abnormality in part of the lung, which is anatomically defined as well. So it's that ability, potentially, to identify which part of the lung is working abnormally, or normally for that matter, which is particularly helpful. And there are a number of situations clinically where that could be of benefit. So one of the treatments, for example, for patients with advanced chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, paradoxically, is that we actually look to remove part of the lung. And the reason that we do that is that these patients are hyperexpanded, that is, that their lungs are overexpanded, which makes the work of respiration less efficient. But obviously, if you're going to take a bit of the lung out of somebody or close off parts of the lung in somebody who's already got quite bad lung disease, then it's really important to know which part of the lung you're going to operate on. And these days, we often put endobronchial valves in to deal with this problem. And of course, if you were able to identify simultaneously both anatomical issues with the lung, but also work out which part of the lung was functioning effectively, that would be a situation where imaging using an MR-based approach might be particularly useful, because you can get both anatomical and functional information. So some of the hyperpolarized technologies tell us about ventilation. If one uses hyperpolarized xenon, potentially you may be able to look at gas transfer or surrogates for that as well. And that could be used to guide treatment. And there are other examples in other chest diseases where that may also be the case. The other potential big advantage of MR-based approaches is that you might be able to identify markers which could be used in clinical trials as early surrogate endpoints. So if one wants to do a study in patients with COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, looking at long-term outcomes, if you want to see a change in lung function, because it's relatively insensitive as a marker of disease progression, then typically you would have to wait for 18 months, 2 years in a clinical study. However, if you were able to do a study which was much shorter, over, say, a 6-week period, and see a change in an image of the lung obtained by MR, which showed that the lung was functioning better at that point in time, you might well have confidence that your treatment will be effective in a longer-term study. So this ability to use imaging as an early biomarker of disease response, or lack of response for that matter, has potential benefits in the clinical trial setting. And increasingly in clinical disease, we are using expensive treatments, often with significant side effects. And again, knowing whether or not a drug is working at an early time point would potentially be a benefit, because we can avoid exposing patients to harm because of side effects of treatment. So despite the fact that MR imaging is expensive and difficult to perform in some cases, then there are some potential clinical situations where I could see that there would be benefits of using this kind of approach. And so there are a number of MR-based techniques which have been developed over recent years, and we have been looking at a number of these in Nottingham. And I'm just going to sort of touch briefly on what these approaches are. So the most widely used of the new lung imaging techniques is probably the use of hyperpolarized inert gases. The initial work, which dates back over 20 years now, of course, was done with hyperpolarized helium. And from a clinical point of view, hyperpolarized helium produces very nice images of ventilation in the lung. The problems, of course, are that it's quite difficult to get to obtain hyperpolarized helium. these days because 3 helium is very expensive and difficult to procure. And the other potential disadvantage is that whilst you get very nice images of ventilation, you don't really learn anything about gas exchange in the lung directly from the images. So there's been increasing interest, and that's something our group has been working on, in the use of high polarised 129 xenon. So whereas the signal-to-noise ratio isn't quite as good as it is with helium in terms of getting images which tell you about ventilation, the big advantage is that xenon uptake into the lung occurs in a similar sort of way to oxygen, and hence one's able to get a reasonable idea of what gas exchange is happening within the lung by looking not only at the ventilation images but at later images, and potentially that can be extended to look at distribution elsewhere in the body, of course. So high polarised xenon has advantages over helium because xenon is easily obtainable, and if one can get over the sort of signal to noise ratio issues, then potentially you can get some really helpful information. And there have been a number of clinical studies utilising this approach, including work that we've been doing in Nottingham. These aren't the only MR-based modalities which have potential in lung disease. So I said at the beginning that proton-based lung imaging isn't particularly helpful because the signal that you get from lung is very weak because of the low water content of lung and the high air content. But actually, some of the more modern sequences being developed using UTE techniques do start to provide information which is comparable with that which you get from the CT scan. I don't think it's likely that UTE-based lung imaging will overtake the use of CT scanning because it's probably going to be more expensive. But having said that, if you were able to simultaneously get good information on anatomical imaging from a UTE-based sequence, but at the same time you were able to obtain functional information about how the lung was actually working in the same image, that would be very attractive. And I think that's the holy grail for MR-based lung imaging, this combination of reasonable anatomical information together with functional information. We've also been looking at some other techniques, including oxygen-enhanced MR approaches. So, from a respiratory point of view, one of the potential disadvantages of xenon or helium-based imaging is that you're asking the patient who's got respiratory disease to inhale a gas which isn't oxygen, and hence potentially you might make their oxygen levels in the lung lower, so they become hypoxic, and that potentially precludes the use of these techniques in people with severe lung disease. Whereas, of course, if you ask people to breathe oxygen, then that isn't going to produce the same sort of problems. The potential difficulties with oxygen-enhanced MR, I think, at the moment are down to getting adequate image which are reproducible and provide useful information in discrete parts of the lung, whereas at the moment I think the sensitivity isn't quite high enough. But this is clearly an interesting approach, and there are other novel-based approaches which haven't made it into clinical development yet, such as the krypton work that Thomas Nisling and his group have been doing. So there is little doubt, I think, that MR-based approaches using